Hi, everyone. My name is Megan Nicholson. I'm a senior editor with Issues in Science and Technology, which is a quarterly journal that is a partnership between the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine and Arizona State University. Today's discussion is being hosted by Issues along with ASU's CSPO, which is the Consortium for Science Policy and Outcomes. I'm really happy to introduce today's discussion, What Happens to Global Science if the United States and China Quit Collaborating? Before I introduce the speakers and moderator, I just want to say a bit about our goal for these events, which are intended to bring really interesting people with expertise in specialized topics together to reflect on the way science, technology, policy, and society interact in the real world. Such a discussion requires experts along with lots of other people. So in other words, everyone here on Zoom is an important part of this conversation. About half of today's event will be a moderated discussion between the panelists, and the other half will be the panel engaging with the questions that you ask and the issues that you feel are interesting and important. So to enter your questions, we request that you use the Q&A function of Zoom. You can use the chat function to talk with each other, but please make sure you use the Q&A to communicate your questions with the moderator. Okay, so let's get started. Our moderator today is Christina Liu, staff writer for Foreign Policy, and our panelists are Bill Colglazier, the editor-in-chief of Science and Diplomacy at the American Association for the Advancement of Science, Sylvia Schwag-Serger, professor in the Department of Economic History at Lund University, Anne Chi Lin, associate professor of public policy at the Gerald R. Ford School of Public Policy and director of the Lieberthal-Rogel Center for Chinese Student Studies at the University of Michigan, and Bruce Guile, project lead at the Applied Research Consortia project. I'm going to turn it over to Christina to get this underway. Thanks so much for joining. We look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Megan, for having us and for the kind introduction. As she said, I'm Christina Liu, and I'm a reporter at Foreign Policy magazine in Washington, D.C., where I've covered how worsening U.S.-China relations are reshaping academic exchanges, university policies, and the scientific community. I'm currently based in Washington, D.C., where there's a strong and growing political consensus that it's time to get tough on China. We're seeing the impacts of this consensus and the resulting policies cascade into the scientific and research realm, which brings us, as Megan said, to the key question underpinning our conversation today. What happens to global science if the US and China quit collaborating? In answering this question and many more, we're very lucky to have a very impressive lineup of experts. We're going to first jump into around a half an hour long conversation before turning to audience questions, as Megan said, that you can submit in the comment section below. Sylvia, Bruce, Anne, and Bill, thank you and welcome and thank you for joining us today. Let's dive right in. Bill, I'm going to start with you. Let's start by going back a few decades to the height of US-China research collaborations. What did that look like, and how does that compare to where we are now? How have rising tensions been reshaping the research landscape?
Sure. No, thank you. And I should mention I'm giving my own opinions, not necessarily those of the AAAS. Yeah, I've been involved for almost 4 decades in scientific collaboration with a number of countries, including with China. And of course, a key event was in '79 after renormalization of relations when the two countries signed the Science and Technology Agreement, which really kind of opened the doors and made it possible for increased scientific collaboration between the two countries. When I was head of the International Office of the National Academies in those days, it was facilitated through the two science academies in the US and China. The US Academy actually had an office in Beijing, but it didn't take long for that not to be needed anymore. And as we know, scientific collaboration between the two countries increased significantly for several decades. My main concern right now is certainly with the very difficult relations between the US and China, that we may be going against what is in our national interest, and that is reducing collaboration and basic fundamental research between the US and China. I think it's in the US interest to maintain that collaboration with the smartest people around the world. Of course, the security concerns are significant, but I think it's something we can manage, and we've managed it in the past.
Gotcha, thank you. And I'd like to turn to you now. You're currently based at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. How important were these collaborations to global exchange more broadly? And what are we now seeing unfolding at the university level? What kind of pressure is this putting on universities and exchanges, and what kind of position are they in now?
Thanks so much, Christina. So I think one thing to understand is that there is this very, very wide spectrum of collaboration. And so a collaboration might be you have a postdoc or graduate students who come from the University of who come to the University of Michigan from China and then return to China, and you continue to keep publishing. That's a collaboration. On the other end, the University of Michigan's medical school has a joint institute with Peking University's medical school. And what they do is a lot of joint research projects. Often, for instance, we have drug trials that are happening simultaneously in the US and in China. And obviously that just allows for a much wider range of understanding about the potential benefits and problems of a new drug. We have an educational collaboration that is students from the Shanghai Jiao Tong University in China being able to get an engineering degree from both universities. Both they stay at SJTU for the first 2 years and then come to UM for their last 2. And in between, of course, we have all sorts of maybe more ad hoc collaborations between faculty and other faculty in universities in these 2 countries, and of course in many other countries as well. So I think sort of understanding this very wide range is really important for thinking about what it means to quit collaborating.
Right, absolutely. Sylvia, from your perch in Sweden, I guess what's the view from Europe and around the world? Are we seeing similar breakdowns in collaborations with other countries, or is this kind of a uniquely American phenomenon?
Thanks a lot, Christina, and it's great to be part of this conversation. So we've been looking at scientific collaborations with China, comparing, for example, the US and Europe. And what we're seeing is, and in the bibliometric analyses we've done, is that there is a significant sort of change in the trends, in the sense that the US and China are decoupling in terms of science. We can see it very clearly in the decline in both absolute and relative publication rates. So total co-publications, but also co-publications as a share of total publications. We do not yet see the same kind of dip or trend change in continental Europe. But we're seeing a lot of universities, I think, as we speak, that are becoming increasingly concerned with collaborating with China across the board. So I think what we're seeing, what's happening, is that European universities are actually very concerned about, for example, they're obviously concerned about some of the risks, but are also concerned about governments and public opinion that might have a very strongly negative view of scientific collaboration with China, and they're trying to preempt those attitudes or those views by actually shutting down what I call much more scientific collaboration with China than would be necessary. And I think it's really important to bear in mind that when you look at particularly continental European countries, so I'm not including the UK in that right now, I think we differ quite significantly from countries like the US, the UK, and Australia, for example, in the sense that we have much less Chinese students. We have a lower rate of collaboration with China to start out with. So I think we are, that's one of my concerns, is that we are actually at a different vantage point in that perspective. And I'm afraid that we're overshooting right now in drawing down on collaborations that would be beneficial to everybody, while perhaps not necessarily addressing effectively some of the risks.
Right. Bruce, I'd like to turn to you now. I'm curious, are businesses and industries kind of navigating these challenges in the same ways as universities? What kind of problems are they facing, and how are they responding?
But let me, I mean, Bill opened the door when he talked about the 1979, agreement with China. Let me start in a slightly different place, which is a lot of what is going on now with regard to business activity around the world dates to the end of the Cold War, so 1990. If you look at any measure of activity, business innovation, globalization of business R&D, and frankly, you'll see an awful lot of this in the scientific collaboration. There was pre-end of Cold War and post-end of Cold War, and the activity level just rocketed through the stratosphere. So, for example, if you go back to stories of Microsoft globalizing in the mid-90s, after the end of the Cold War, Microsoft set up their first lab in Beijing. Okay. And we now have Microsoft labs in Cambridge, Beijing, Seattle, and it is one integrated system of corporate research, which has been reinforced, aggressively by what you call the globalization of the supply chain. So think of the business supply chain not as I'm the designer in Cupertino and everything else gets done someplace else where I have the knowledge here, but the globalization of the supply chain means that the innovation ecosystem for most companies is already global. Okay. It's not that it's done someplace or the intellectual work is done someplace and then it's shipped someplace else to be executed. And the rising tension between the US and China has a huge impact on that supply chain activity and on the globalization of corporate R&D. And from my view, and this is maybe counterintuitive from the perspective of the issues community, from my view, most R&D and innovation is actually performed by companies in industry, as opposed to by universities. So you have basic research that happens in industries, but there's a tremendous amount of sort of crossover, so that the rising tension between China and the US creates a whole different set of issues for companies. And the universities are kind of brought along in the process, is what I would say. So as Bill and I have exchanged plenty of texts about this or emails about this, I'm a complete enthusiast for true, open science and basic sharing of research. And I don't see why there's any reason why you should worry about rising geopolitical tension. Short of a hot war, you can continue to collaborate on basic science right up until, people start throwing bombs back and forth. But that doesn't work very well for the modern economic system, where you have that approach, which is great openness across borders, doesn't work very well when you have companies that are supported directly or indirectly by governments who are doing their best to create economic security for the nation where they're supporting the research. So if I'm investing in science and tech, like the new NSF directorate is supposed to do to support the development of the nation, international collaboration becomes problematic because it's hard to make sure that the return comes to the citizens who are paying the dollars to invest in the research. Well, let me stop there. That's probably more than you wanted to hear at the front end.
No, that was a really interesting point. And because you mentioned Bill's name, Bill, I might turn it over to you. Would you agree with these sentiments or?
Well, it's a complicated issue when you talk about the economic competition. I mean, in the US, our government has realized there are very close connections in certain fields between the research going on in universities and the research being done in companies. I think the leading companies in certain areas recognize that a lot of the talent, really, the intellectual talent, is in the universities. One thing the U.S. government did was to create research centers at universities, and that the companies could invest in ceramics, materials, all kinds of different things. So a very close connection in many fields between the frontier edge of basic research and companies that are looking at technological applications out of those. So it does make it very tricky, as Bruce indicated. But Bruce, and when he said that we should be able to do open research no matter what's happening in the world, except for when bombs are flying, that's actually not what's happening in the US right now. There's tremendous pressure, perhaps even to create, basic research goes back, at least the way it's sort of defined canonically, from the directive during the Reagan administration, basic research should be open unless it is classified. Now there's actually strong pushes to actually having more areas of unclassified basic research, for example, and I think that would be very destructive. I'm really looking at this solely from the U.S. interest, not being a Pollyanna at all. It is in the interest of the U.S., in my view, to work with the smartest people around the world in areas of basic research. That's how we're going to learn what they're doing, what their countries are engaged in, but it's also going to lead to ideas that actually can be very useful for our own economic welfare in the future. So But it does get very complicated when we talk about technologies. I certainly agree with that.
Sylvia, oh, sorry, Anne, were you about to say something?
Maybe just very quickly. I think this issue around, does national security include economic security? How we should think about that, Bruce and Bill have been talking about is really, really important because, I think we currently talk about the US government currently talks about our relationship with China as one of, strategic competition. And they do that partly because they are aware of the level of anti-Asian violence and rhetoric that could be, created if they spoke of, war with China, for instance, or, but this is really, if we're going to talk about this in terms of competition, we really need to think a little bit about what kind of competition are we talking about? Is this competition like Survivor, where you want to throw other people off the island, or is this competition like the Olympics, where you compete and then you come back the next year and compete, and, you have the same athletes competing over, a period of years, over their lifetimes? And to just like press the analogy forward a little bit, right? The US, not only trains great Olympic athletes that support the US, we train great Olympic athletes that support other countries as well. Very often, the athletes who are competing in the Olympics for other countries are at American universities. And that interaction not only benefits them, it benefits us. It gives us, the better, people to compete against. It helps us understand, what the situation, what kinds of human physiology, human training, is better for competition, etc. We gain a lot from that open competition. Imagine if we thought about it instead as, oh my God, we can't train somebody who's coming from Germany because they might bring the medal back to Germany. So if we are really thinking about, to just finish this quickly, if we're talking about competition like Survivor, where we're hoping to kick China off the island, we're going to fail. That is not happening. And we need to just understand that China is, a large country with lots of smart people and and an economy that is adapted to the world, and it is going to be there. We are not going to get rid of China. So if instead then it's a competition where, or if it's a competition we hope we'll win every competition, where it will always be the US getting the gold, silver, and bronze medal, I think we're going to be pretty disappointed, But if we're able to sort of invest in the type of scientific environment that has made the US the science and tech leader of the world, then we also have to understand that, no, we're not going to win every competition. No, companies in other countries, including China, may take a lead in some types of technology, but we are investing in an ecosystem, and we believe in that ecosystem.
Thank you. And I'd like to kind of continue in that vein and pivot to Sylvia. In your forthcoming piece for Issues, you wrote about how we could be entering a new era of research in which there are different kind of geopolitical blocks. Is that the future, and what are the risks there?
Yeah, I think that is one of my big concerns right now, is that is happening. And in a way, it's happening actually quicker than the regulations are being put in place. Because as I said, if I could phrase it cautiously, having been in the leadership of one of the largest research universities in Sweden, university leaderships are not known for being the most risk prone. So they try to hedge their bets, and they don't want to, especially public universities, do not want to be seen, do not want to expose themselves to criticism. So my concern right now is that even though a lot of measures are being put into place where the emphasis is on de-risking, as we talk about in Europe, I think that we're going beyond that, unfortunately, and that's what we can see in these cooperation. We're starting to see this in these cooperation patterns. And for example, there are examples of large European technology universities that have essentially stopped hiring Chinese citizens. And perhaps even more so people of Chinese origin, so it's not always a clear distinction. So I am concerned about that because I think aside from all the obvious benefits of the global enterprise of science, for society, for the economy, I'm also concerned that we're starting to see different norms emerging about, and I think Bill mentioned that in one of the conversations, what norms should we have around science, the independence of science, academic freedom, the freedom to teach, the freedom to choose your partners. I think we're at a point where the world is sort of distant, where blocks are sort of distancing themselves from each other in terms of their view of science, and also how science relates, for example, to government, but also its role in society. And I find that quite troubling.
Thank you. Bruce, I'd like to turn to you. How should we be weighing kind of these risks of, as you mentioned, economic security with the cost of disengagement? What's the right balance to strike here?
Well, let me return to your earlier question and then come back forward to this one. The earlier question was, how is business responding to this? First thing is, I will say that the ARC project is a joint creature of Fraunhofer USA, so the German contract research entity, the U.S. arm of that, and then UC San Diego, so an Asian-oriented U.S. university. And we have participants in this activity from the UK, from Canada, from Japan. So the structure here that I'm accustomed to dealing with is this globalization of economically oriented research that is lodged within what you would call the liberal democracies, okay? And I want to go to this point. The idea, Anne, is not, in my mind, to kick China off the island, but to recognize, be clear-eyed about the fact that the Chinese economic system is quite different from that operated by most of the liberal democracies, whether it's human rights or, frankly, the relationship between companies and government. The notion that somehow US and Chinese companies are the same, or US or Chinese and German companies are the same, is just false. In many cases, Chinese companies, which have big research portfolios and relationship with Chinese universities and relationship with universities and liberal democracies, are, and I use this provocatively, they are basically agents of the state in a way that US companies are not. And I don't think of this as evil. It's just different. And to not recognize the difference in terms of the relationship between the private R&D enterprise and companies in a place like China or an authoritarian state like Russia, and how that happens in liberal democracies is just, it's sleepwalking, assuming that nobody has moved the furniture since the end of the Cold War. And so the idea is not to isolate China, but the idea is to be open-eyed about the way their system works and how it's different from liberal democracies, and respond intelligently. And I'll give you a quick example, then I'll stop and turn back. When CHIPS Act was passed, Chuck Schumer stood up and said, thank God we'll be able to compete with people like China and Germany. And I thought, what the hell? Excuse me, but Germany is a long-standing ally that's a liberal democracy whose companies behave, very much like our companies. And this whole issue with regard to competing with China is an entirely different picture. And while it's possible for most academic researchers to ignore these differences, it erodes when Chinese companies play a supporting role for US academics or for projects, and they are in some ways representatives of the state, whether that's the military or the economic aspirations of the country rather than the profitability of the company. So let me stop there. That's a lot to cover. But it's a very different system, and we have to be alert to the fact that it's quite different.
Thank you, Bruce. And I think I see both Anne and I believe Bill who have responses. Anne, why don't you go first?
Just very quickly, I actually completely agree with you. I think it is a very different system. I think we need to understand that. I think our current approach to both research security and scientific collaboration is sort of doing exactly the opposite of understanding that. That is, it is doing a sort of blanket, oh my God, there's the potential of risk, let's stop. Or what I think is equally damaging, disclose every potential tie, disclose every potential pain point. And if you don't, and the lack of disclosure is in and of itself a problem. I think both the way we're trying to think about it and the way we try to regulate it is not following, or is based on a very shallow understanding of China. And we need I think in order to do a better job of regulating, which I agree with you, we absolutely need to do, we have to understand what it is we're competing with.
Thank you. And I'll turn to you, Bill, sorry now. What in your view is kind of the right way forward here? What's the right balance to strike here?
Well, first a comment on the economic competitiveness issue versus the hard security issues. The hard security issues right now are driving everything. If we didn't have those, I don't think the economic competitiveness issues would be hard to deal with at all. We've dealt with those in the past. And the hard security issues are really significant, mainly with these emerging technologies that are truly dual use, AI, quantum, whatever you want to mention. They all have potential great opportunities, but they also can create tremendous risks. And a lot of the leading work is being done in the basic research area. Like I said, it's also very close to the technological applications. And much of the research also is being conducted, such as with AI in private companies. So those issues really have created, I think, the biggest predicament that we have right now. How can we maintain open collaboration, even including in these areas that are very close to technological applications, but at the same time, protecting our national security interests? I know politically, economic competitiveness is a big issue, but I think that is really could be dealt with quite easily if we didn't have these hard security issues.
Thank you. I'm going to fold in one of our first audience questions now because it relates to what we've been talking about, and I'll pose this to Sylvia. The question is from Anonymous, but I hear concerns that we are overshooting in restricting research collaboration. Where should we draw lines, if at all? What are the principles that should guide these decisions? National security, human rights concerns, economic competitiveness concerns? Sylvia, I'll ask that to you first.
I think that's an excellent question. And I think it builds on nicely also on what Bill just said. I think, first of all, if we look at the history, and I've been looking at collaborations between China and Europe now for almost 20 years, if you look at some of the history of the collaboration, for example, between China and Europe, you can see that there are certain collaborations that shouldn't have happened very clearly for ethical reasons. So I think one of the things we need to think about, it's almost like we went through a phase where we thought that certain ethical aspects did not apply to collaboration with China because everybody was so positive about engaging China. So I'm thinking sometimes when we need to draw the lines, we have existing norms and standards that if we applied those, then there's certain collaborations we shouldn't engage in. At the same point, exactly as Bill said, we call what I also call there's certain collaborations in fields which are difficult, where there's dual use implications, significant economic issues, where China is actually very, very strong in fields of material science, in fields of computer science, in physics, where I think it's to our disadvantage, as one of the other panelists said before, if we just say in the interest of just simple de-risking, we're just going to pull back. Rather, I think we need to think about these certain collaborations, which will be to some extent perhaps rather high risk, but also high reward, and think about how can we structure these. And I think one of the really difficult things, and this goes to the heart of the relationship that I talked about before between the state and academia, is that I think in some cases academia is a little bit at a loss of how to handle these risks or how to manage them. So I think we need to think about certain areas which are strategically extremely important for Europe or for the US, economically, technologically, in terms of national security, where it's not risk-free to collaborate with China, but we need to do it in a way where we can handle those risks, because the opposite would be to just say we're pulling out of certain areas where China is now gaining a strong advantage in certain technological fields. And I think it's going to be to our disadvantage. So I think the guardrails are extremely difficult. I would also just want to put in one thing, which is perhaps a little bit controversial, but one of the things we've seen when we've interviewed a lot of companies in Europe, but also scientists, is that there are companies that are concerned about collaborating with China, but they feel that they would like some kind of support, but they feel that they don't have a choice because they're making short-term profits, but they know they're transferring the strategic know-how to China. And my final point is, sometimes scientists say, as long as we're doing basic or pre-competitive research, it shouldn't be a problem. I don't think these lines are as distinct as people would like to make them out to be, to just say, you know, basic research is fine, pre-competitive research is fine. It's not as simple as that. Thanks.
Thank you, Sylvia. This is something that I just thought of now, but Bruce, I know you've written about how we need a new playbook for research engagement when it comes to commercial and defense issues. This kind of ties into what Sylvia was saying, but what should that playbook look like?
Well, I have a very simplistic view of this, which is drawn from, I have to credit a colleague, Harry Broadman, who wrote a spectacular working paper comparing US S&T agreements with trade agreements and investment agreements. The way that trade agreements are negotiated in the US is there's a model agreement and there's a consultative process that draws very broadly on the community, whether it's labor or environmentalists or companies, to negotiate trade agreements. The investment agreements are negotiated very much the same way. There's a process by which these investment agreements are structured. And what characterizes them is they are enforceable. They become genuinely not memorandums of understanding, but they become structures under which national governments work with local institutions to manage exchange, is what I would say, exchange and collaboration. There's very little in the tradition of S&T agreements, and Bill knows this better than I. He's been in this world most of his life, that has anything like the characteristic of that. You know, if you violate an investment agreement, you can be taken to court. If you violate a trade agreement, well, when the WTO was working, there were sanctions that could be put in place. If you violate principles of national treatment or reciprocity in an S&T agreement, there are literally no enforceable consequences. You're left with a position where you have basically a rule-free environment for a massive aspect of international exchange and collaboration. And so I would say, to the extent that you can argue for the governments of liberal democracies taking S&T agreements, which cover both what you would call pre-competitive commercial technology exchange, investment, trade, and research, and wrap those into a single negotiating process, you'll have at least a structure. So it isn't quite, oh, this faculty member at this university knows this person, and therefore they're going to craft this kind of agreement. Now, you want that sort of innovation to happen, but there's literally no rule book for any of this. It's all sort of made up. And so I think, to the extent that you can argue for a sovereign to sovereign process for negotiating these kinds of exchanges that is enforceable, I think it would be a huge step forward. The liberal democracies should do this amongst themselves, and we should especially do this with China. That's a long answer for a short question, but...
No, thank you, Bruce. Bill, I'm going to turn it to you. What is the Biden administration getting right and wrong here?
Okay, and I'll give my opinion on that, but sort of in the framework that Bruce has laid out. With the S&T agreements, I think there's a big difference, again, between basic fundamental research and for cooperation on technologies. I think dealing with technology cooperation now with China is probably going to be much closer to the type of trade agreements that we have. In terms of basic research, I think it's going to have to be a discussion of the norms and rules that we all sort of agree to adhere to. And if the other party doesn't follow them, then the penalty is going to be we're not going to collaborate with them or with those institutions. I think that's the only approach that we can take. Well, what the Biden administration is doing right, I think, I don't disagree that much with some of the things the Biden administration has done on the technological side. I mean, it's a way of sort of punishing China for some of the bad practices that they have used. But in terms of basic research, I think actually, because I've had lots of discussions with Chinese scientists, particularly when they cannot be overheard. They pretty much agree with us, particularly those that were trained in the U.S. They would like to influence their government, not to do some of the things that the government has done regarding using basic research as an avenue for spying or stealing technology. So we have to give them, I think, more help in being able to influence their own government. You talked in the beginning about the current S&T agreement. I strongly think the U.S. should renew the agreement and use it as a vehicle for negotiation with the Chinese, both on basic research, but it also can be used on the applied things, turning that more into the type of agreement that Bruce is talking about for technological cooperation.
Thank you, Bill. That's a great actual segue into our next audience question that I will pose to Anne. From your experience at the University of Michigan, how are Chinese scientists and researchers viewing the risks and opportunities of collaborating with U.S. scientists?
Are we talking about Chinese scientists, or are we talking about Chinese American scientists?
It says Chinese scientists, but let's open it up to both.
Okay, because I do think there's quite a big difference. One thing coming out of the pandemic obviously prevented a lot of the kinds of sort of exchange, et cetera, that was happening prior to the pandemic. And I would say that post-pandemic, we really have not picked that up. That is, again, obviously not just because of the pandemic, but because of this, very fraught collaboration environment that we currently have. I think faculty are not clear, and the universities, frankly, are not terribly clear about what's okay and what's not okay. And there is this, I think, Sylvia discussed this as well, this sort of, pulling back because we really don't know what we're not sort of saying, here's a policy of pulling back, but people are pulling back because they're not sure what is going to be problematic. And I think a lot of this comes from the current way that that offices of research at universities and the national granting agencies are trying to control collaboration by really asking people to do lots of disclosure, lots of record keeping in ways that are not really connected to the kind of which are not really connected to the risks or the benefits of a specific collaboration. So for Chinese American scientists, the reason I really want to make this distinction is I really want to say, on the one hand, that I think both the Biden administration and Republicans in Congress have been much more careful about statements that could harm Chinese Americans than they used to, and I think that's absolutely a good thing, and I'm grateful for it. But I should also say that I think the atmosphere for Chinese American scientists right now is really, really fraught. And it's fraught not so much because there's been a proclamation, but because when people go abroad and they come back into the US, they're pulled aside for Customs and Border Protection interviews. And those interviews include copies of papers that the particular scientist has written and pictures of websites, of their collaborators in China. Students are being pulled aside and asked, what they work on and, why, and, why should they should be allowed to work on, and what they intend to do after their degree is received, et cetera. And so there's a lot of this ad hoc questioning and investigation, which I think creates a lot of fear and discomfort.
Thank you. I'll turn to our next audience question, which is from Edgar Bello. He writes that the U.S. has been collaborating with many Asian countries since the end of World War II. And Sylvia, I'll actually pose this to you. Why has collaboration with China been so tough? And also, who are the other key collaborating partners of the U.S. and China?
Who are the key collaborating, your last part of the question, who are the key collaborating partners of the US in China?
Yes, I guess who else have they been collaborating with on the global stage?
The US. Yeah, it's real. I don't know if I have the definitive answer to that. But one of the things we've looked at is, for example, lately we've been looking a lot about how countries like South Korea are handling these rising tensions, because they have to tread a very difficult path, right, between trying not to alienate China, but also concerned as a democracy about some of the collaborations with China. So I think it's very interesting to look at how South Korea has been handling collaborations with scientific collaborations with China. One of the things, and I don't know again if that's one of the answers, but we have seen that collaboration with China between the US and China, but also lately with a certain delay between Europe and China, has sort of really taken off. You know, it is really one of the engines of the internet, global enterprise of science, is particularly the collaboration between China and the US. So when we talk about this enormous explosion of global science, the collaboration between China and the US is really the cornerstone of that. It's the engine. And so then the question becomes, when that engine starts to sort of stutter, or, you know, what is that going to do to this global? And that's why we talk about this new age. So I think that China is different in many ways, it's different because it has a completely different system. It has also a very different view of science and the relationship between science and the state and the responsibility of a scholar in the scientific system. It's obviously different because it has it's a different scale, it's a different size. It's become a key player in certain fields. Another really interesting thing that perhaps we haven't talked about is that China is really increasing its footprint, not just in Europe or in collaborations, but for example, in regions like Africa, where we've seen that collaborations between China and African scientists, for example, in fields like engineering, if I'm not mistaken from my data, if I remember correctly, it now exceed, for example, co-publications between the US and China in engineering. So there is this tremendous increase. So I would say China is very different from many Asian countries. Interestingly, also, for example, if you look at Japan and China and Japan and South Korea and their collaborations with China, to my knowledge, we haven't seen the similar explosion in co-publications that we saw between the US and China, and also to a certain extent between Europe and China. So it's been a more gradual increase. So this is my point about how I think we saw this tremendous increase, and now we're seeing this perhaps slight overshooting in the decrease.
Right.
Can I jump in? A couple of things. One is just to go back to this idea of the agreement. You know, I know that Bill wants to draw a distinction between trade and S&T agreements, but I think that if you think from the perspective of an individual university that's trying to evaluate whether or not it's going to be engaged, there are a couple of bedrock principles that come out of the trade and investment environment, which are open publication. Comes out of the academic environment, but this issue of reciprocity and national treatment, which is, if you were a university that chooses to participate in a collaborative activity with not just a Chinese institution, but a European institution, the core bedrock principles on which you could evaluate this are reciprocity. You know, is there an actual exchange, or is this simply some sort of a gift one way or the other? And is there national treatment, which is, can my researchers be treated as though they were nationals in your environment? And if you combine this open publication with national treatment and reciprocity, this logic of national sovereign to sovereign agreements drifts down in a way that allows individual actors like universities to evaluate their engagement in a way that is in the interest of the country, is what I would say. So it is possible to flow a lot of this stuff down from trade and investment into scientific collaboration and agreements. And then the other thing that I think we actually have found in a hard disagreement between Bill and I after many exchanges. And Bill, your comment about the fact that if it weren't for national security, we could deal with it all. I think that's wrong. I think that if you talk to people from other parts of the world about how they view the U.S. national security enterprise, it is viewed as a commercial entity working on behalf of the United States. They are deeply suspicious of export controls. There are lots of examples where people from other countries look at US national security concerns as a thin veil over a commercial agenda. And they're not wrong, is what I would say. So yes, it's possible to say if this were really, truly all about national security, yes. But I think that there's a huge sense in which every country has an almost irresistible urge to use national security to cover their commercial interests. And it's embedded in things like the WTO, where certain amounts of trade are exempted because they are considered to be important to national security. So we have this structure where national security is the fig leaf that many countries, including the United States, use to cover a commercial agenda. So I would say, even if there weren't national security concerns, we would still be in this fight.
Thank you, Bruce. And Bill, since you were mentioned, I'll turn it over to you. Do you agree with those sentiments, or?
Sure. I don't disagree with Bruce that many countries, including the U.S., use sometimes national security to cover really their commercial interests. But what I would say right now, because I deal a lot with the Department of Defense, I deal with other countries, Germany, with Japan, it is the national security interests which are driving things right now. There is serious concern about countries like China attaining technologies and capabilities that the U.S. does not have, whether it's military, can be applied commercially, yes, too. So in terms of creating new restrictions on basic research, I think it's primarily coming from the national security threat as perceived by security professionals and intelligence agency professionals in the U.S. government. Again, I said, I think there are ways to deal with these things. I think in many of these areas, like in artificial intelligence, the government is really not going to understand exactly what the real risks are unless they're really having a dialogue, constant dialogue with the leading researchers in this field, the same as in quantum information science and the same as in synthetic biology. That's where we understand where the real risks are. And there may be some cases where there are right now, or even in basic research, it's going to become restricted, that information, because of the size of the risks that are presented. I think it's actually a small list of things that are going to fall into that category. But right now, because the security side has the upper hand in these discussions, I think there's an overreaction, and the scientific community, both in the US and China, is very nervous. And so they're being ultra conservative in how they approach it. And that's going to have an impact as well.
I would not disagree with that.
Mm-hmm.
Can I just add one highlight to what Bill said, which is that it's not just government that should be involved in creating these kinds of agreements or protocols. The scientists really have to be engaged in it. And I think there's this sort of expectation that, well, we don't want to get the scientists involved because they just care about, what they can publish, and they're not going to be aware of these different risks. And I think that's wrong, frankly. I mean, I think there are lots of different areas of technology. Nobody in the US government, whether that is NIH or NSF or OSTP, is going to know as much about these areas of technology as the people who are working on it. And so let's get those people involved in thinking about what the protocols ought to be.
Thank you, Anne. We're approaching the end of the hour, which means that it's time for our last question, which I will pose to each of our panelists here. I think probably in the order of, I'll start with you, Bruce, and then we'll go to Sylvia, Anne, and then end with Bill. We've mentioned this in conversation today, but if it's not renewed, the US-China Science and Technology Agreement, which was first signed in 1979, is set to expire this month. Let's say you have the final say on its future. You can decide whether it should be renewed, changed, or allowed to expire. I'd love your kind of elevator pitch on what you would do and why. And Bruce, we'll start with you.
I would argue for renewal contingent upon Chinese agreement to engage in a much more robust negotiation process to deal with some of the problematic issues, both in national security and in the commercial side. And given the history of these kinds of negotiations, this will be the opening salvo in a decades-long interaction. But if we don't take that step, it won't happen.
I guess my follow-up question to that, and also to everyone else, is do you think it will be renewed? What direction do you see this going in?
I am not close enough to be able to answer that question.
All right, Sylvia, we'll turn it over to you then.
I think I strongly agree with Bruce. I think this is, I think it would not be good for any country or for science to not renew this agreement. But I also think that it would be a good opportunity for, I mean, and I also apply this to, for example, Sweden has had S&T agreements with China for a long time. You know, think about what are the things that we need to start having a serious conversation about, or that we should make this STA agreement contingent upon. I think that would be definitely a good moment to do that. And I think perhaps it's not the worst timing. And also, as Anne said, I think one of the tricky things with China emerging as a global science power is that we need to find a different way also in democratic countries, how scientists and politicians and policy or government should interact around these difficult questions. We need to find a fruitful dialogue where we can draw upon each other's competencies. Frankly, I think that's something that, at least in Europe, we haven't been that used to, because we haven't been confronted with this kind of challenge of the rise of a science power, which also is an economic power, which also poses a threat to national security. So I think so I would agree very much with what Bruce just said.
Thank you. Anne, all yours.
I agree with what Bruce and Sylvia just said. I think there's going to be a lot of temptation to say, well, this is an easy win against China. This is easy way to look tough by canceling this agreement. And that, I think, not only would it send the wrong signal, it really does sort of foreclose a set of opportunities, as Bruce, I think, said earlier, to have a serious negotiation about what the terms of this collaboration ought to be. So I hope it gets renewed. I think, I don't think we should think of renewal as just boilerplate, let's go off on our merry way. But I'm afraid that it will be a cheap signal.
Thank you. And Bill, to you.
The Chinese view the S&T agreement symbolically is very important. They've indicated their willingness to enter negotiations about what sort of amendments in terms dealing with rules and norms, for example. But if we do not renew it, I think they've also sort of made it clear that really all bets are off. It may actually make it extremely difficult to even collaborate with China in fields that actually have no security concerns whatsoever. So I think it would be very foolish for the US not to renew the agreement, but to say we want to engage with the Chinese to talk about all the issues that are causing the concerns and problems, both on the basic science side, but also on the technological side. I think the agreement could be the vehicle for both, or the two could be separated. So I think it'd be a terrible mistake if the Biden administration abrogates the agreement.
Can I add one thing? Just going back to Anne's comment about having scientists involved. I mean, one of the reasons I bring up trade agreements is because the negotiating process forces the development of an internal consensus before it's put on the table in front of another country. So I would argue that the way to proceed with regard to the US is to ask for a full renegotiation, but then do a broad consultative process internally with the scientists, with companies, as to what this agreement should look like going forward. Because I think if you don't bring the other parties in, and this is a government-to-government agreement, it will have the same problem that it has had in the past, which is it's crafted between knowledgeable and capable government representatives on both sides, but it lacks the input from the full community and consensus building within the country.
Thank you, Bruce. Awesome. Well, those were all of the questions. That was my closing question, but I want to open up the floor to Sylvia, Bill, Anne, and Bruce, if you have any last comments before we close.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot. For me, it's been super interesting. I do think there's still some interesting, listening to this conversation, some interesting differences between also Europe and the US and how we view these issues and how we view the links to, for example, national security. I think there's a lot more that could be said about that and how we explain those differences. But to me, it's been a really interesting conversation. One thing that I think about a lot is that, for example, countries like the US, the UK, Australia, extremely dependent on Chinese students for their tuition fees. You know, this is something that continental Europe is not. I think that is also something that when we talk about these, for example, dependencies or these concerns that people have, I think we have to think about these differences in how we structure our conversations around China. But I would love to talk more about those topics, sort of the differences in the European and the US approach. But it's been a great conversation. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, no, thank you all. And unfortunately, we do have to close here because we are out of time, but I'll turn it over to Megan now. And thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you. Let me reiterate my thanks. Thank you so much to Christina, Bill, Sylvia, Anne, and Bruce. This was a really interesting conversation because of the different perspectives that you all added to this rapidly changing space, which has huge implications for the future of research and the flow of people and investment supporting the global science enterprise. And I want to reiterate something that Sylvia said, that we might be at an inflection point where the norms of science and its relation to global trade and the national security enterprise is changing. And I think this conversation really put a big spotlight on the importance of those dynamics. To all the folks who joined today, if you like this kind of conversation, you have come to the right place. You can read more of our work at Issues in Science and Technology at www.issues.org. You can also find episodes of our podcast, The Ongoing Transformation, there. And you can sign up for our newsletter, which gets sent out every Friday morning and features notes about upcoming events, new essays from across the science and policy landscape, and bits about what the editors are reading and doing lately. So yes, thank you again for joining us. Thanks to the panelists. Thanks to Christina for leading a great conversation. And hopefully we will see you next time. Have a great rest of your day.